From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress and our celebration of Native American Heritage Month. Our committee is pleased to have two impactful speakers with us today, which we will be filming. We would like to thank our sponsor, the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity Programs, and our sponsor and host, the Law Library of Congress, for supporting this event. Please take some time, if you haven't already, to see some of the items that we have on display. We have some items from Geography and Maps Division, and we also have some materials from the Law Library of Congress relating to the Seminole tribe. And to get us started, we're going to watch just a short introductory video about the work of the Indian Law Resource Center.
These are the core beliefs of the Indian Law Resource Center. For more than 30 years, the center has been a global force, challenging and building legal frameworks to enhance the lives of Indigenous peoples. One of the major causes of the economic and social ills within Native communities is the unfair legal rules that apply only to Native peoples in the United States. We have taken on cases on behalf of the Timbisha Shoshone and the Mohawk Nations and others with the goal of changing some of these laws. We also seek to strengthen sovereignty rights so that tribes can better protect their people. This is more critical now than ever.
1 in 3 Native women will be raped in her lifetime, and 3 out of 5 will be physically assaulted.
The center's hallmark work is related to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
We wanted to be sure, and we wanted to establish legal rules that would make it clear that Indigenous peoples really do own their land. They really do have full and complete legal rights to those lands, that they have rights that can be protected in the courts, rights that are protected by definite rules of law that can't just be thrown out or ignored by courts or countries and their governments.
The declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007.
And as you know, in April, we announced that we were reviewing our position on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And today I can announce that the United States is lending its support to this declaration.
This is just a snapshot of the work coming out of both the Helena, Montana and Washington, D.C. offices. We at the Indian Law Resource Center are experts in Indian law, working to protect and preserve Indigenous peoples and their communities. Our ultimate goal is to make positive contributions that will have lasting effects. Visit www.indianlaw.org.
Our speakers today are Armstrong A. Wiggins, the director of the Indian Law Resource Center, Washington, D.C. office. Born in Nicaragua, Mr. Wiggins is a Miskitu Indian from the village of Caratá, Nicaragua. He was the founder of the Indian organization called Al Promisu and was the coordinator of municipal affairs of the East Coast for the government of Nicaragua. He was also the national representative of the regional Indian organization Misurasata. Mr. Wiggins was arrested twice during both the Somoza and Sandinista regimes and became a political prisoner because of his work to promote human rights for his people in Nicaragua. In 1981, Mr. Wiggins was forced into exile. It was at this time that he began working for the center as the director of its Central and South America program. For the past 20 years, he has worked on numerous human rights cases involving Indigenous peoples, including the Yanomami in Brazil, the case against Nicaragua in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 1984, which led to changes in the Constitution of Nicaragua for the recognition of Indigenous rights and the creation of autonomous Indigenous regions in Nicaragua. He worked on the case for the Maya in Belize, Mr. Wiggins played a leading role in the precedent-setting Awastigni case within the Inter-American system, and he has also played a critical role in the Center's standard-setting work with the United Nations and the Organization of American States, particularly regarding the declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples. He currently supervises the work of the Center dealing with human rights, standard setting, and multilateral development banks. Leonardo Crippa is an international law scholar and practitioner. He holds a JD from the National University of Tucumán in Argentina, and an LLM from American University. As the Center for Justice and International Law's staff attorney, he litigated several human rights cases within the Inter-American human rights system. In his current work as the senior attorney of the Indian Law Resource Center, he analyzes multilateral development banks' policies and continues to practice international law within the United Nations and the Inter-American human rights system. He is also the author of papers on constitutional law, international law, and multilateral development banks policies. They will be interviewed by Carrie N, Lyons, Section Research Manager and Legislative Attorney of the American Law Division in the Congressional Research Service here at the library. She is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. Carrie, take it away.
Thank you. I'd like to first thank everybody for coming out today and supporting us for Native American Heritage Month. We really appreciate your taking time today to come and join us when we have two fabulous guests with us. And thank you both for coming out. We're very honored to have you today. And I'm just going to jump right in with the questions right now. So first, I also have to do a disclaimer, though, that any views expressed by me are my own and are not official representative of Congressional Research Service. So let me get to the question. So can you tell us generally about the work that you do at the Indian Law Resource Center and a little bit more about the structure and how the organization came to be?
The Indian Law Resource Center is founded by Robert T. Coulter. He's a Patawanami person. He's also a judge in his community. Represent his nation to the Organization of American States and to the United Nations. Tim went to Columbia Law School, and from law school he realized that one of the biggest challenges the indigenous people faced was the very lack of law that indigenous people understand. And the law is very discriminatory against indigenous people. We're talking about the European legal system that came to the Americas,
right,
that indigenous people had a hard time understanding and fighting. We're talking about the laws that came from Europe. Indigenous people had a hard time fighting against that system. In the past, they can understand their struggle between the cowboys and Indians. And you know that most of the time, cowboys were the good guys, Indian was the bad guys. And so that was very heavy challenge. And when the legal system come, and very, very racist legal system against the Indian government that existed in this continent, it was very hard. First, because they don't understand the language, they don't speak English, and so it was very discriminatory. So after Tim went to law school and came out, he decided that he needs to form the Indian Law Resource Center to represent traditional Indian governments against the Washington influence of how to destroy Indian way of thinking, Indian philosophy, Indian way of looking at issues. And so they give lots of money to Bureau of Indian Affairs to destroy traditional Indian governments. And you know what happened. The history will tell you what happened to indigenous people from this terrible legal thinking. And so Tim wanted to create the Indian Law Research Center so that we can represent them for free. Because lawyers were one of our Indian worst enemy, because they will represent them, and if they do win a case, they owe the lawyer more than what they were supposed to pay. And so they didn't get any benefit from it. So the Indian Law Research Center is a non-profit law office that we don't charge our clients. We find our own money to represent Native people. The other interesting thing is that we do not accept government money. We raise our private money from foundations, individuals, to represent Indian governments. We do not represent individual, we represent collective governments.
Okay.
And so that's how Indian Law Resource Center was created, founded in 1978. And since then we've been there. We settled in Washington, D.C. at Eastern Market area because we're close to the Library of Congress. In the old days, we used to come here a lot. We used to get to know everybody at the legal staff. Now, you don't see me anymore because of internet. But in the old days, you guys were my friends. We used to live here. But now we don't come.
Right.
So that's the Indian Law Research Center. And then Tim decided to move to Helena, Montana, because there are more indigenous people there, so we can work with them closer.
Right.
And so the office is, the Washington, D.C. office deals with the Hill here, the Congress, the White House, the OAS, the Organization of American States, because you have the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Inter-American Courts, and the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank. All this has to do with policy affecting indigenous people, because the bad economic policy also affect indigenous people to take away their land and their resources. And a lot of people still believe that we're against development. We're not against development. We're against the kind of development that the capitalist system brings to the indigenous community that take away the land. So we believe in sustainable economic development.
Right, right. Leo, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, something to add is that the fact that as an attorney, I found that the center is unique in the way it represents clients, communities, because the way the center handles the case is it's a very long process through which the center attorneys will basically sit down with the communities that the center will represent. They will assess their, the attorneys will assess their legal needs, the aspirations of the community.
Oh, thank you.
The legal systems of the country, and with a local council that the community will select in the country, we will build a legal strategy. In other words, we basically translate into a political strategy the political aspiration of the community based on international law, especially human rights law. That's unique. I've done that only here at the center, and I worked before in another organization that also handled cases internationally, but the center is unique in that way of working with the communities from the very beginning and building the legal and political strategy from the bottom.
Well, this lead.
And I want to add to that, because that is very important to understand. What we do is the political leaders' speeches is very important to us. And when you're thinking about environmental issue, when you're thinking about land rights issue, when you're thinking about how we live collectively for generations in this continent. And so we take that, we listen to them, and we turn that project, their political speeches, into a legal project to educate what collective rights mean, what land subsurface mean to them, that compared to Europeans, what they mean, what individual rights versus collective rights mean. You know that European doesn't believe in collective rights. Everything is individual rights. We do not really believe that. We also believe that human rights is collective and individual rights. You live with community, you live with your village, and you protect your village people, not just you individually. And that's where unfairness comes. That's where when people become rich and then you have 4-4. You don't have that collectivity way of sharing your resources that you have, your land resources, whether it's gold, whether whatever. So that is why our way of thinking educate the legal system in the United States. And that's what we call law reform. Law reform is very important, and that's how Indian Law Research Center challenged the legal system in the United States and challenged university law schools. Because we believe lawyers have very influential position in our society in this country. Lawyers become president, lawyers become senators, most of them. Lawyers become judges, from Supreme Court right down. And if they don't understand our way of thinking and the legal way of indigenous people look at their issues, their political issues, then that's where discrimination comes, sometimes by ignorance, not understanding our issues. So that's why the legal project, and one thing is very important, we don't tell our clients what to do, they tell us what to do. Because in the past, lawyers will tell them how they should think, how they should do things. We want them to tell us they're our boss, and so that's how we create a legal policy to help indigenous people basic human rights.
Well, speaking of law reform and cases, Leo, can you tell us about some of the most interesting or maybe most challenging cases you've had?
Sure. I'll talk about the most challenging one. That was the Rapa Nui case. Rapa Nui is the native people of basically Easter Island, an island in the part of the Polynesian Triangle on the Pacific Ocean.
What is that again?
Yeah.
I didn't hear what that was.
Rapa Nui is an island in the Pacific Ocean, and the native people there is called Rapa Nui too. And so the case, but we actually didn't have a case, but we got the request from the Rapa Nui Parliament, a request to basically help them secure their lands, regain control over their lands, because in the early 90s, the Chilean government moved them from their traditional lands to a concentration camp in the island called Hangaroa. And in 1966, for the very first time, they were basically released and were able to walk free in their own island and became, for the very first time, citizens of Chile. And so it was around 2009 when we received this request, and we've never heard about them. I was on vacations in Argentina, and they decided to put me in a plane and send me to Chile because it was a short flight.
So your vacation was cut short?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I remember that.
Yeah.
And so basically I landed in this island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a very small one, with a population of about 5,000 people. Around 4,000 were natives. Rapa Nui, all of them speak their language. They are Polynesian. And they decided...
Leo, can you speak up a little bit for the people in the far back?
Sure.
Okay.
And they decided to go back to their traditional lands. In the past, there were 18 traditional clans, and so the clans decided to go back. And what they found, in some cases, were public offices, in other cases, businesses, and they put their own flag in that area and started to occupy the land. And so they were in the middle of that action when I landed there. And it was challenging because I had to assess, as I said, what were their legal needs, how the Indian Law Resource Center from Washington or Helena, Montana could assist them. And I found myself visiting each of the areas that had been preoccupied by the Rapa Nui families and clans. And I knew that Chile was going to react violently because there is a history of how Chile interacts with the Mapuche people in the south of Chile. And so basically after a week of being there, I flew back to Washington, D.C., reported back to Armstrong and Tim what I was able to learn. And reported about 3 actions that we could take. One was immediate. We had to secure protection measures from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights here in Washington, D.C., so that preventive actions would be ordered to Chile, so the government of Chile will not basically act violently against the people of Rapa Nui. That was around October. The second action was basically recover a very important moai. Some of you may know or heard about moai. It's one of that's actually a lot of moai. It plays a very important role in the Rapa Nui culture. It represents the traditional occupation of each of the clans, and you will find statues like this all over the island. They are based on a rectangular base, and that is called ahu, and that's where the ancestors of each of the families are buried. I didn't believe that until they started to show me what was below, and it's true. And so the second action was basically try to recover from the Museum of London one of the most important moai that was removed from the island. It is being shown there. And the third one, which is the most complex one, is seek self-determination, because it is an actual colony in Chile. And so the first one was challenging. I had to represent about 4,000 people. They never took a legal action against Chile. They heard for the very first time from us. And so I started to get the power of attorneys
Wow.
for each of the clans. And I ended up filing a request for precautionary measures with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights here in D.C. After 2 months of legal debates with the government of Chile, the Commission decided to grant those protective measures. By the time it was granted, the entire island was already militarized. There were special forces.
Wow.
And I never forget this, on December the 3rd of 2009, there was a huge operation against each of the families, and most of them were removed violently, and there were shots, people lost their eyes, and so forth. Unfortunately, the precautionary measures were granted afterwards, so I wasn't able to prevent that, and it was a very violent situation. But in the end, the armed forces were moved back to continental Chile. The government was forced to have a dialogue with the traditional Rapa Nui authorities for the purpose of discussing the issues of their main concern, and that happened for over 4 years. And so I stopped the violence in the end, but I wasn't able to stop the most violent operation that happened against them. And so that was very challenging to me. The most interesting case that I have right now is against Guatemala. It's before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it is representing a small Maya Hekchi community in the northern province of Izabal. And it's a case where this community has been under a land titling program for more than 4 years without getting the final title because of irregularities in the land survey and the land titling.
So they're supposed to get the land, but they haven't actually gotten it yet. Okay.
And in the meantime, the Ministry of Mining has issued permits to a private mining company to explore and exploit nickel on the lands belonging to this one community. And so we filed a lawsuit against the land titling agency. We never thought we were going to win, but we won that case after 2 years, long process. Unfortunately, the government of Guatemala is not enforcing this court decision, and so we were basically, we had to sue the government of Guatemala before the Inter-American Commission, and this is now an international case. We are seeking the international responsibility of Guatemala because of the violation of these communities' right of property over the lands that they possess. It is now on the admissibility stage. We won that stage. The Commission has released the admissibility report saying that we fulfill all the requirements set forth in the American Convention on Human Rights, a main human rights treaty ratified by Guatemala. And now we're discussing the merits. And it's very interesting because it touches the very structure on how lands are taken away from indigenous communities based on how fraudulent the land survey and titling system works in Guatemala.
Oh. So it seems like whenever you do take up cases that's a long-term commitment, and you know, some of these cases can take quite a while before they are ever resolved.
Yeah, I remember that Leo came in later, but Indian Law Resource Center biggest challenge. I mean, first of all, I'm a trained electrical engineer from my first career. Okay? I never dreamed to be speaking to you on legal and human rights issues, because we used to, and my specialty was in antenna. I was supposed to be an astronaut, right? That's my interest, you know, electrical engineer, pilot, go to Cape Kennedy and go up. But my people, in Mosquito, people called me back to come home, and that's how I get involved in politics and end up in jail twice. And I think one of the things that very challenging from Indian Law Research Center perspective was to change things. And I guess that's what happened between us at the Indian Law Research Center. I think that one of the things that we are is very important is work so close with our leaders, our people, and work with them and do the work that we need to do. And so our big first challenges was in Nicaragua because of the Cold War, and I'm sure all of you know that divided us in Nicaragua, divided Americans here because of Reagan administration versus the Sandinista government, the contrast, and human rights was divided, and I was in the middle of that here because I came out of jail here, and I challenged Senator Kennedy, Senator McCain, Senator Dole, everybody, that there was not black and white in Central America. There was indigenous people in the middle of that black and white, left and right. And so a lot of people didn't take side. And I'm sure today in Washington, you all see what's going on. During the 80s, something was going on like that too. The divided family. Everybody was divided because of taking side. And Indian Law Research Center was in the middle of that challenges. And from that challenges, we have now in Nicaragua autonomous government for indigenous people. We have special system that was set up. Our constitution was improved because I bring cases against Sandinista government that changed the Nicaraguan constitution in 1987, more progressive towards indigenous people. We brought a legal case against Yanomami, the Yanomami case in Brazil, that now Yanomami have a Yanomami Park in Brazil. These were uncontacted people that we represented. I went in there, in their community, that you have to deal with them to get their land rights. Now they have Yanomami Park in Brazil, one of the biggest land rights issue that happened in Brazil after the Kayapo people in Brazil. Then we bring the case against Belize, the Mayan people. Now they have their land rights approved by Belize Supreme Court, recognized by the regional court in the Caribbean. Belize, the Mayan people, now they have their land rights. And then we have the biggest one was the was Stingley versus Nicaragua, which now the international community recognized indigenous people land throughout the inter-American system. And so those are some of the challenges that we face, and we struggle through that and get support from the international community. And the other challenges was to create international development, international standard, international declaration, which this is the United Nations Declaration, and this is the American Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People that was just adopted last year in General Assembly of the OAS. So all this is here. If you people wants to read what these declarations.
I think they're outside.
So it's outside.
Yes.
And so this is what Leo was talking about just not too long ago. So we face a lot of challenges ahead of us still. And you see even from yesterday at the White House, we still faces a lot of discrimination, a lot of struggle that we need to overcome regarding our people's rights.
Well, can you tell us about some of your experiences working with tribal governments in the United States on VAWA? Because that's a bit of a success story.
Yes, that's VAWA is a big success story, but it's ongoing.
Yeah.
And a lot of challenges that we face in the United States because, as you know, VAWA was first introduced by Senator Biden in 1994. And they went through a lot of process till 2013. VAWA was approved.
Right, so VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act.
Women Act, yes. 1994 and 2013.
Right, reauthorization in 2013, yeah.
Yes. And so we, as we speak here at Indian Law Research Center, my staff is in Alaska, meeting with Alaska Native Women organization that the federal government just gave them $1 million to work on their human rights issues, and that we're working how to implement VAWA. So there we're having workshop right now as we speak in Alaska talking about how to implement VAWA. Some of the challenges that we face has to do with economic aspect of it. For example, because of the jurisdiction issues, between the non-Indian legal system versus the Indian legal system, and how that can be worked out and negotiated, who is going to pay for those expenses.
Right.
And so it's an ongoing thing, but one of the things that we feel very good is that we have a lot of good women, Native women, leading this fight. And I can name many of them, Terry Henry, others that are leading this fight nationally. And so we are just supporting them and working with them, helping them, fundraising. Jana Walker from our office is the head of one of our senior lawyers based in Montana. She's leading this work with Chris Foley, and we had Carla General in our office here in DC. She just went back to work for her government in Six Nation territory. But these are wonderful people that fighting for this, how to implement.
Right,
VAWA.
right, great. I know you also did some work with the Seminoles of Florida and gave them the opportunity to buy back some land. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, Seminole, these are, there are two groups of Seminoles. One is the traditional Seminoles, and the other one that is more successful one. They have casinos, and they have hotels. And
Hard rock, right?
Seminoles, I think that was one of my interesting experience because they don't believe in compromise. They believe that they need to be left alone. They want to have their own traditional ceremonies, and they lost land, and so they used to borrow land from citric growers in Florida to do their green dance ceremonies. And so they look to us for help, how to get land that they lost to have their traditional and then their homes, to build their homes the way they want, tipis, basically. And so we represented them, and I think that was very difficult because, from my experience, because they won't compromise.
Oh.
In other words, it's hard to negotiate between non-Indian versus them. But we were lucky to go outside of Florida, look for help. And I don't know if you heard about Lannan Foundation. It's based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a very rich family, Patrick Lannan. One day knocked at my door here in DC and said, in a blue jean, dressed like somebody that don't have money, and he said, I am Patrick Lannan, and I want to talk to you guys about how we can help.
Help the Seminoles.
Not only the Seminoles, the Indian Law Research
Oh.
Center. We are interested in education. We want to help tribal government, technical schools. We want to give them money. And so I'm here. I heard about you guys, and we want to talk. And that's how it started. And Patrick Lannan paid for this huge land in Florida for the Seminoles, $1.5 million.
Wow.
From the citric growers that they used to do their ceremonies. And so now they have a land that is not only the Seminole have land to do their traditional work, but this land will be protected environmentally. And they have bald eagles, they have alligators, and is not destructive way of development. They have, and then the other fight we had with the state of Florida was the teepees, because they wanted to build their own homes, and because of rules of building codes, the Florida government said no. So we tried to get, all the newspaper on our side to make, kind of challenge the state, and the state finally did give in and let them build their own typical homes to have their own traditional ceremonies.
Wow.
So that's a great story.
No, that's a success story, yeah.
And the other day I was I ride the metro from Washington, Virginia to DC, and there were some native kids, high school kids, in the metro, and they were laughing and joking, and they come and sit by me and start talking to me, and I said, where are you from? She said, I'm a Seminole from Florida. We were visiting Washington.
Wow.
I said, do you know Uncle Billy? She said, that's my uncle.
Oh, wow.
How do you know my uncle? Of course I work with them.
Serendipity.
They're very excited. And, a week later, the uncle called me and said, thank you for talking to me."
Nice, very nice. Have there been any cases or issues that you wanted to take that you've been unable to take at the center?
Oh, there's so many.
Mm-hmm.
If we have if we get money from the government, the European government offer lots of money, but we don't accept it because sometimes they put conditions. I don't know why. There's so many cases. For instance, land titling is so important to us, legal rights to their land. And if you watch the world changing towards our issues, Europeans begin to support Indian thinking about how to manage land, how to manage natural resources, and that help climate issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so land titling is very important so that indigenous people can manage their land. Protected area, how can we take away from World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, and others that only follow the money trail, especially USAID money, but when that money finished, they move back to Crystal City or move back to Roslyn because they don't have money to stay there, so then the bad guys move in and destroy the environment. And they don't respect indigenous people land rights. They only work with the central government. And so that's the problem. If indigenous people manage those areas, those land, like Basawas in Nicaragua, and many other places in Brazil, only the bone that fall from these environmental organizations, they get money from USAID, goes to the indigenous people. But then when they move out, the indigenous people have to face the poacher, the people that cut their land and their territory. We would like to work with them in Brazil. We would like to work with them with the Brazilian banks that is very, very bad against Indian land rights issues. Take away Indian lands by building highways and dams and stuff like that. You know that the BNDES, which is the Brazil bank, has more money than World Bank right now. And so they give very destructive development that is not good for indigenous people. And so we try to educate these banks and develop legal mechanism to respect indigenous people land rights, but we don't have all that money to do that. European are now beginning to give some money. They just created an institute in Stockholm about Indian land tenure issues.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know if we'll go to the indigenous people. And that's the thing. There are a lot of discrimination about money given to indigenous people also. And because, you know, intermediaries.
Right, right. Leo, is there any case you wish you could have taken?
Most of the main reason why we don't take a lot of cases is money, basically. We can't represent all of the clients that we would like to. So we're very selective about the cases that we take, especially looking into the issues that if we take a case, we'll basically gain reform in the law and politics of that country. And so that's the main reason. However, there are situations where we start looking into the case, documenting the facts, starting to interview local authorities about the issues that the indigenous communities are concerned. In the end, when we are about to take a legal action and we have secured some resources, the issue is resolved. So no case. And I can mention a few examples. One is the Florio Cayali community. It's a Shipibo community in the Peruvian Amazon, close to the border with Brazil. There was an interoceanic highway that was going to be built with funds coming from both the Brazilian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank that will basically connect Cruzeiro do Sul on the Brazilian side with Pucallpa, Peru, and will basically divide up the land where this community was located. And so we started to inquire where the funds were coming, what were the permits that these companies had to build that road. In the middle of that, the Rory Guimaraes, the head of this Shipibo community, started to talk to civil society locally in Pucallpa and then nationally in Lima, the capital of Peru. So we started to make some noise about it, and in the middle of that, the transportation authority started to cancel all the permits. They basically redesigned the project, and as a result, they're not going to divide up that community, and so we had no case to take.
Okay.
And there are situations like that, but mainly it's lack of resources. We're very selective about the cases because we actually want to have a huge impact in the country, and we want with one case to benefit not only our client but also other communities that are in the same legal and factual situation.
Right.
The other thing that we would like to is the new thinking between United States all the way to probably Argentina, that most of the coastal communities are indigenous land and resources. And now, because of wind and new energy system, they're going to affect them in a different way in indigenous community without consulting with them, without indigenous people benefiting from these wind they're going to set up for energy use.
Oh, like the wind farms and
farms, the benefit doesn't go to indigenous people. It goes to Walmart, it goes to, like in Mexico, it goes to Corona, factory, Corona Beer Company and other big corporations. And so we've been asked to help in that, and I can talk about that too. In Mexico, what we just did was one of the biggest project in Latin America. But it's going to happen even in my territory. In Mosquito Coast is where all the Atlantic coast is where the wind is, and it's Indian land, and so now Indian land has been challenged by governments. One of the good things is that Indian Law Research Center, because of negotiating with all these states for over 30 years in Geneva, I was the founder of the UN declaration beginning in 1977.
Wow.
Tim and I was there at the beginning. I remember when we woke up that morning, we couldn't get out to go to our meetings because the school bus came from all over Europe to see Indians, right? Because that was the first time we came to Europe to attend the United Nations, 1977. The working group started in 1982, and the declaration was adopted in 2007. Imagine how long we negotiated, especially with England, was the most difficult thing because England didn't believe that individual rights is human rights, so they will not support us. And so we wanted consensus to be developed in the United Nations. And then the Organization of American States, we negotiated since 1989 to work on the declaration. And that is because Spain wanted to celebrate 500 years of discovery and wanted to give money to the OAS. And so they wanted to come up with something about indigenous people. And you know, OAS was a good old boys place. No NGOs could participate, no Indians come there, only them elected people. And we said, no, we want to be part of that negotiation. And as Canadian ambassador said it, that Indian people kicked the OAS door open for not only for indigenous people, but for civil society and for NGOs, non-governmental organization. And so really, Indian Law Research Center was advising Indian leaders, coming that, giving legal advice, and because of that, all member states, whether OAS or the UN, have a lot of respect for us because we are very serious about these challenges and try to kind of be balanced and diplomatic about, you know, our rights.
Right.
I am not just a professional in the Indian Law Research Center. I was the Indian leader.
Yeah.
You know, so I can also keep the lawyers in balance too, from our leaders' perspective and from the scientific perspective as an electrical engineer. You know, so we have a different view in this world when we face these issues. It's very challenging.
Yeah.
And I hope a lot of young people can also follow that in the future. We're doing that. We're trying to train our young leaders, but it's very hard because of the economic aspect of Leo was talking about. Because you know, a lot of young people, a lot of our interns, our fellows that come to our office want to do what we do. There's a lot of excitement,
yeah.
But then they owe a lot to federal government to pay back after they become lawyers. Our professionals, I want other professionals, not just lawyers, but they have to pay back.
It's true.
So it's very hard to do human rights work, you know, and that's the challenges that we face too.
So we have a few more minutes, and I wanted to open it up to questions if anybody has any. So yes, sir.
According to a newspaper report in Nicaragua, new canal equivalent to Panama Canal start construct with huge Chinese assistance. Is this? I want to hear your view towards this projected canal construction. Sure, environmental destruction and affect the indigenous people in the area. Could you give me your opinion about this?
Yes, Nicaragua government is now populist government. You know what populist government means. You have one here. But there are more dictators than here yet. I mean, because they have check and balance here in the United States. I hope we don't lose that check and balances. I hope we hang on to that so we can challenge the executive branch. But in Nicaragua, they control all other government branches, whether the legislative, the legal branches, and the military, the police, and control the election process also. And so they negotiated with this Chinese guy, individual guy, and they decided to pass this law 84 that is very, very bad against indigenous people and peasants, poor people. And then Nicaragua Lake is the biggest lake that have fresh water, and we have freshwater shark and freshwater species. Nicaragua Lake give water supply, drinking water to Chontales, which is one of the biggest state, or they call it departamento, but it is state. And then Rivas, which is another big state that give drinking water. Can you imagine opening up a canal from the Pacific to the Atlantic? Then when you go to the Atlantic, you're dealing with indigenous people, Rama Indians, and Creole, black community that feel like they're also like indigenous. They live there. And the Garifunas, also a black community. Their land is also owned collectively, not individually. And all that is going to be affected. Can you imagine all the shark will die when salt water comes in. And so everybody's fighting against that. And seems like the guy is an individual, very rich individual. Looks like he lost a lot of money during the crisis in China with the stock market. And so it's kind of calmed down. We are hoping that Chinese government is not behind that. And we're hoping that because Panama Canal is just being renovated, make it wider, the big ship can pass. The reason they wanted to do it through Nicaragua is because Asian ships, some of them are huge, that couldn't go through Panama, so they wanted to build a canal bigger through Nicaragua. But what happened is Nicaragua is wider, longer to cross, more expensive, and one of the biggest problem is Nicaraguan government cannot protect from terrorist attack against the ship. There has to be a very powerful country to protect, like how U.S. protect Panama Canal, and it has to be China. But China is not that far yet to do says so. We don't know, because we understand the U.S. is also pressuring China not to do that. So it's on hold right now, but we don't know what can happen going forward.
Did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I think for one way you have a very good insight about the problem and you recognize a collective effort. But on the other hand, I think you are saying you cannot have the resources to tackle individual cases. The problem is you allow them to divide individual, then eventually your donation from those very faithful individuals who want to donate, eventually they don't have the resource because their land, their home, their asset, their account are all victimized. So eventually you are going to have some kind of unjust influence by those big donors, maybe financial institution, maybe some NGO, they get money from the Chamber of Commerce or lawyers. So I think probably eventually you may have this, but you may have a bad legislation that victimizes all your people. So how are you going to solve that? Unless you try some effort, how do you connect with other good people, good civic organization? May not be the ACLU, may not be the NAACP, but you must have somebody to work with you to solve individual problems. Otherwise, you are going to have vicious cycle. So I just wonder, would you be able to do something, put some effort in that? Because that is an American problem, that would be Indian problem
I'm
too.
not really sure of the question.
What's the question? I don't know.
My question is, can you really solve individual problem based on justice and fairness? You are talking about America have check and balance, but I don't think so, because everything is controlled by those lobby interest groups, and so individuals are not protected. So if you are based on a private donation, the individual cases, they want to donate, they don't have resources to donate because they are victimized.
Right. Well, I think.
Donation unless accept the big corporation or a big financial institution who are going to victimize you even further. Maybe eventually you don't even have that.
Well, I'm not really sure what the question is, but I think it goes to like the difference between taking on cases collectively or individually. But
the basic question is really you must based on concept of justice, fairness, not based on who is giving you donation.
Right, right, and I mean, I think you've somewhat addressed those questions when you talk about how you pick cases and where you get the money from, and yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you for your question. Let me clarify some issues. Maybe that will help all of us. We have various different projects through which we try to reform laws and policies that will eventually improve the situation of both communities and individual members of that communities in developing countries and in the U.S. One of those programs is actual litigation, where we take a case and we represent a community or a people against, it might be a government agency or a company, and we use the legal system of that country. Other programs include influencing policies of public sector financial institutions, like, for example, the World Bank Group, where you will find the International Monetary Fund, the International Finance Corporation, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, well known as the World Bank, and other regional banks, like, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank. And what we've done since the 80s under that program, where we work on policies, is push these banks to create a policy, a safeguard policy, that aims at preventing harm to communities and the environment through the projects that they finance. And so, even though some countries and some donors put money in these institutions, we pressure these institutions to have policies so that those getting funds from these institutions, in some cases developing countries, in other transnational corporations operating in developing countries, will have to comply with the safeguards of these policies. For example, we got the World Bank in 1981 to adopt the first indigenous peoples policy. In 2006, we got the Inter-American Development Bank for the first time to approve an operational policy on indigenous peoples. We are now working with indigenous peoples and organizations in Brazil to get the Brazilian Development Bank to develop its first operational policy on indigenous peoples. And at the same time, we educate donors about how important it is to provide support to indigenous peoples on the ground that are fighting corruption, that are fighting government agencies trying to get their lands, conservation organizations trying to manage their natural resources. And sometimes we get support, and sometimes not, but we find ways to work through the legal system of the country or these international organizations so that we can either get an international instrument like the declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples or bank policies on indigenous peoples for an actual case to change the way indigenous peoples are treated in some countries. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
So I think I also try to understand when you say vicious circle, but I want you to understand that we, from our perspective, we do respect collective and individual rights. We respect that. I was jailed and my territory, my people defended me. That's why I'm alive. I was arrested in Managua, Nicaragua, in the capital, from my office, close to Daniel Ortega's office. I was defended through my individual rights, not collective rights through my villages. Okay, so sometimes it benefits us and we respect both aspects of it. But let me just tell you one example of what just happened to us. Not too long ago, we've been trying to get money from law offices, but there's sometimes conflict of interest. We've been trying to get money through corporation. Sometimes there might be conflict of interest from corporation. We got some money from Mitsubishi Foundation in New York. This is Japanese car makers foundation. We decided maybe we can get that to work with the RED Plus issue, the RED issue that you heard about, talk about. This is environmental issue. Environmentalists know what is RED, a RED program. The European come up with all this environmental thinking. First was GEF, then now RED, okay? Which means whatever, if you have a lot of trees, you can get money from your trees that is in your yard or is in your community, okay? That's RED program. So Mitsubishi was interested in that. But we never thought, we didn't know when we decided to represent indigenous people in Mexico about the wind issues that I just talked about. Well, the biggest money was coming from Mitsubishi and Inter-American Development Bank. And so Mitsubishi said, you stop representing the Indians or we will not give you the money. And we said, we will not stop it, you can stop the money. And that's what we did. Okay, so it's something that...
It's a balance.
It's a balance.
Yeah.
It's a balance. So I just wanted to clarify that too.
So I think we have time for one last question.
Yes.
You talked about Guatemala, which has almost half of its population is indigenous, and they have been considering a law that would recognize indigenous law to some degree. And but it's stalled in part because of objections from business communities who want to be able to exploit natural resources. coexist with like the national laws of a country like Guatemala that emphasize individual rights? How can you have those two function and coexist when you have cases?
Yeah, there are some precedents though in Guatemala. I remember a decision issued by the Constitutional Court where it was a criminal case against a Maya leader, not Maya leader, a member of Maya community after the Maya traditional authorities of his community applied sort of a sanction against him because of the behavior that was against the community's traditions. But anyway, his case ended up in the Guatemala's criminal system. And so there was that case brought to the attention of the courts. The Constitutional Court basically said that indigenous peoples in Guatemala have a legal system through which they can resolve controversies. And if the controversy where a criminal issue has been addressed by the community, the state courts have no jurisdiction to persecute those that have been already sanctioned by traditional authorities. So that court, the Constitutional Court, applied what is non-criminal law as the non-bis in idem, which means no one can be subject to criminal charges twice, basically. But that's just one example and one precedent, and I remember this because current lawmaker Amilcar Pop was one of the attorneys who represented this member of the Maya community. The controversy around collective land rights and the country's legal system oriented to protect private property is not such a big controversy because there are already laws in Guatemala that tend to protect collectively held lands. Like, for example, the law that created it is called the Instituto Nacional de Transformación Agraria. It's like an agrarian institute that basically will execute and enforce all of the agrarian laws that were passed by Congress in Guatemala. And that law tried to provide some protection for peasant communities. In that way, it was a good objective, but it was at the same time not that good because indigenous communities were included there as peasant communities, and as a result, all of the agrarian policies are applied to indigenous communities as if they were peasant communities without considering their legal nature as an indigenous people with all these rights are recognized by international law in their favor and so forth. And so there are some precedents in both court decisions and in actual legislation that tend to protect collectively held lands. But unfortunately in Guatemala there is no actual legislation that recognizes indigenous peoples, communities' legal personality, nor their collective ownership over the lands that they possess, and that is why there's a lot of land conflict. Whenever there is a conservation project on indigenous lands or an extractive industry project on indigenous lands, but I would say that the best way to work towards a reconciliation of these different laws or legal approaches is by making indigenous peoples sit on the table and have an ad hoc consultation with them so that Congress can hear them and make them participate in the development of the bill. And that is something that already happened in Peru for the consultation bill that was approved last year by the Peruvian Congress.
I think it's a very good question and sometimes have me sleepless nights. And I remember when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN, he went to Bolivia for the first time, and then he came back and he called me up and he said, "Can we have lunch?" So I had lunch with him right at 8th Street. Now we get famous. And one of Kofi Annan's question to me was, Armstrong, I know that Bolivian are indigenous majority, just like Guatemala, but he didn't go to Guatemala. He was coming from Bolivia. And he said, but how can we find a leader that can bring everybody together instead of taking what happened to them to go against the minority non-indigenous people? How can we find in Bolivia something what happened in South Africa, by South African leader? And so it's a tough question. I said I don't have the answer. Education is key to do that. Like what happened in South Africa. Even though he was in jail that long, he became president and he worked with everybody and pull everybody together. Guatemala situation is the same thing. If you think about in China, it's a communist country, right? China economy is paying all our bills here in the United States because China keep pulling out of our debt, right? And China still have one. And so what's going on in China is now they're bringing to their Politburo all the rich people. But they can't question the collectivity, the cooperative system of Chinese system of government. So one of the things that we're thinking, hoping, is that we get education to all indigenous communities, that they can become voting power. And it's not half. In Guatemala, probably 60% in my majority. Can you imagine if they vote like what your founding father said, our founding father said here, that educated people can vote the right way, that who they believe can be a good leader. That's not what happened in Guatemala. Okay? So if they can vote their own president, my leader like Amilcar Pop will become the president. But we're not there yet. Even the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica, which is the OAS, Inter-American System, rule with the case of Yatama versus Nicaragua, and they rule in favor of indigenous people have the rights to have election according to their history, according to their culture, not imposed by the capital city political parties. If that happened in Guatemala, and I'm sure Indian person can be a president in Guatemala, but we're not there yet. And so if Indian person can be a Guatemala president and negotiate with the business community, I'm sure they can meet a middle ground to have a better life for indigenous majority. They can negotiate that, but we're not there yet. But it will happen. I'm telling you, not my lifetime, but in the future that probably will happen because they're the majority.
Okay, so I'm getting the signal we should wrap up, but I'd like to thank you both again for coming out. This was wonderful. We are so grateful to have you here. And I'd also like to thank everybody for spending time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.